My purpose here is to offer a kind of a view of the museumscape of Berlin. And I have chosen the title between Heimat and Heimat. It's a little fatherland, let's say, and Deberlinisation, which is, of course, an invention coined by some activists and artists some decades ago, and we will see what exactly it could mean. So, why Berlin, I would say first? Because it was in the last years, really, or at the end of the 20th century and beginning of 21st, a privileged city, I would say, for literary critics and postmodern critics. I will quote first Andreas Wiesen, who wrote at the beginning of our century, "Berlin is a city text, frantically being written and rewritten," unquote. So this is, of course, this idea of palimpsest that we will see everywhere in my examples. Why? Because of course, of the fall of the wall, of the unification in East and West Germany, with the transfer of the national government from Bonn to Berlin, and above all, about this fact that Berlin leaves behind its heroic and propagandistic role as a flagship or a flashpoint of the Cold War, and struggles to imagine itself as a new capital of a new reunited nation. So it's like, and I will quote again a reason, it's like a prism through which we can focus issues of contemporary urbanism and architecture, national identity and statehood, historical memory and forgetting. And it's true that a lot of books have considered Berlin and this moment of its history under the point of view of architecture, because the rebuilding of Berlin as capital of Germany had given a lot of clues for understanding national identities in the contemporary world. But it's also very interesting with the question of museum. This museumscape, its landscape of museum, is about. First, is the result of several centuries of considerable collecting and scholarly tradition, such as, for example, the Hohenzollern tradition. And you might see that this view of Montbijou as a French legend, vue générale de la maison de plaisance de Sa Majesté le Roi de Prusse, nommé Montbijou sur la Spree, because French was, of course, the language of enlightened elite in the 18th century Germany especially. So in a very classical move, this palace began to be transformed as a museum during the 19th century, and at the end of the First World War we have this Hohenzollern Museum with a dynastic ordering of the rooms and a kind of very characteristic and very traditional display of decorative furniture and dynastic pieces. And finally, what happens is that a museum was completely destroyed during bombing the Second World War, and after that it was completely politically incorrect to imagine to restore a Hohenzollern museum, because of course it was like the symbol of the Prussian and militarist state. So this is in fact my first example, but the only one really of a complete disappearing of a former museum after the Second World War. This long history or this long tradition was in some extent largely broken by the war and by the destruction, and after that by the fact that the borders move and that finally the city was cut in two pieces. So this unprecedented division of the two parts had considerable consequences for museum, because the collection were in the western part, more or less, and the building were on the eastern part. So decision was made to build new buildings on the western part, but with the fall of the wall, the point was to make a kind of reconstitution and reinvention of these former museums, but also to create new museums, and especially memorial museums. The most memorable museum memorial, the famous Checkpoint Charlie, we will return to that, and some memorials to the Jewish killing, mass murdering, and other institutions linked directly, more or less, to the Second World War. But even in the Berlin landscape, you have public art, such as this very famous one, because it's just in front of the railway station, Train to Life, Train to Death. Not so good, I would, according to me, but about, of course, killing people, and above all about some two symbols which are very frequent in the museum about Holocaust, or about displacement of people, that is to say the idea of a railway, transport by railway, and the suitcases, which are really a kind of universal furniture in the museum dedicated to migration, transportation, and all that. In the same movement, there was an attempt, and there is today, this is one of my subjects, an attempt to bring Berlin global. It's a title of a part of the Humboldt Forum, multiple exhibitions in the Humboldt Forum, and this is in fact a part of the Heimat Museum of Berlin, Märkische Museum. So it's a kind of a corner, if you could imagine that, a corner dedicated to Heimat, to Berlin, but they have chosen to make Berlin global. And this Berlin global is about very contemporary issues, such as punk music, night clubbing, fashion, and so on, which are supposed to bring to visitors a new image of this vibrant Berlin at the end of the 20th century. In the same time, the older location of the Western Museum was Dahlem, because in this kind of bourgeois outskirt of Berlin, there were the buildings for specialized museums, such as the Museum of Ethnology, of Folklore, of European Ethnology, and so on. And Dahlem is a kind of suspension or time, let's say suspended time between the past and the future. And it's supposed to become more or less a storage, general storage, and also the general laboratories of the Berlin Museum, instead of being the center, as it was during the Federal Germany period, the center of German museum around Berlin. My talk will about this point. First, a new Athens on the Spree, that is to say, the idea to rebuild what was the situation of the Berlin Museum in the first half of the 20th century. That is to say, rivalizing with Paris, London, Vienna, and of course this idea of antiquity, such in the Athens in the famous formula. Two, Museum of Memory, because of course it's a big issue in post-war Berlin and after the fall of the wall. Third, the crisis of the Heimat and the crisis of the local history museum and the transformation of this local history. Four, the question of the Humboldt Forum, that is to say this world museum with post-colonial issues. And finally, for conclusion, some words about this idea of laboratory, which is a laboratory of museums, let's say, and also a kind of field study of museum by some universities, especially Humboldt University. So, Berlin, a new Athens. The man we will talk about at different times in my talk is Hermann Persinger, who is the president of the foundation, of the Cultural Foundation of Prussia. He has been president since 2008, and he is a kind of minister of culture. And in 2017, he said that Berlin, I quote, has by far the largest museum complex in Germany, and it is the country only true universal museum, end quote. So it's a very characteristic consideration due to the federal character, of course, of the country. And he said at this moment that he had settled a program with three main projects. The first project was Museum Island. The Museum Island, you must know in this situation, which is a complex association of different museums built at different moments. The island was designed by UNESCO in 1999 as a World Heritage Site, and not only because of the architecture of these 5 museum buildings, not only because of the exhibits, of the quality of the collection, but also, they said, because the island displays the history of the very idea of the Western Museum. So this group of museums stand for the Enlightenment conception of museum. They are cultural treasures. They are assembled for public utility or public edification. They are located symbolically at the center of a capital. And they are working, they are contributing to an allegedly universality of art and knowledge. So the first of these buildings was this old museum, which was the work by Schinkel. It was 1828, and it was really a model for a lot of architects and a lot of museums around Europe and more. It has a very clear plan with a Panthéon-like rotunda with divinities of antiquity. It was, at the beginning at least, open on the air, like an antique monument. And it was housing Etruscan, Greek, Roman treasures. It was joined at mid-19th century by the new museum, which has been worked a lot after that, and in the mid of 1870s by this fascinating Greek temple set on a kind of acropolis, which was the National Gallery. And finally, at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1908, there were what we call now Bode Museum, and which is a neo-Baroque building at the extremity of the island. And the last one was the Pergamon Museum of the 1930s. And it was designed to house the excavations, of course, of Pergamon and other sites. This series of museums have been partly destroyed, partly bombed during the war. So there was first a restoration by the GDR, by the communist Germany. And after that, after the end of the war, by the most famous one was by the architect Chipperfield. And it was first a de-restoration of the communist work. And after that, the invention or the creation of a palimpsest. That is to say, the idea that it was what Chipperfield called, I quote, a memorial to destruction. We must see the destruction, and in the same moment we can see the palimpsest of 19th century decor, the great murals, great mural paintings, and the contemporary situation. In front of this chaotic situation, the administration decided to create a new museum by always David Chipperfield, which with the name of James Simon Gallery, which is very interesting because James Simon was a Jewish philanthrope and a great name in among the donators, the philanthropes of this museum, but of course, as a Jew, he disappeared. So the return of this name is very meaningful. And this gallery, in fact, is supposed to coordinate and allowing the circulation with a tunnel between the different buildings. I will quote here the Architectural Review in 2014 with an article about this Museum Island modernization, let's say, under the title Curation Consumption. And they said the new building and its associated tunnels will provide a single access point, a singular orientation for the museum's new metastructure. But it's a kind of a new epistemology. First, because, of course, no longer are the museum's individual collection of distinctive treasures, with each artifact yielding potential lessons. Instead, they are brought together as a brand, reoriented as a singular heritage, made representative of a past, whenever and wherever that might have been, sold for entertainment and consumption. And I would say that we have nearly everywhere this kind of reorientation in huge museums such as the Louvre, for example, which was split during the 19th century and first part of the 20th into departments, which were more or less each a small museum. And now all departments are supposed to put together to create this kind of enormous, huge global Louvre. And we have this kind of structure today. And the Architectural Review made a comparison not with France but with Britain and the reconfiguration of the V&A Museum in London, saying that in mid-80s the V&A was rebranding itself with the famous company Saatchi and Saatchi about rebranding as a nice cafe with a quite nice museum attached. And they said ironically that Berlin did better or will do better because the James Simon Museum is no more a museum. It's not a museum, just a cafe and a restaurant with a great view on the Spree and a big commercial and shopping mall. The conclusion of the article was that finally this new island museum in the Chipperfield project was a Schinkel museum in the last century. It was a contemporary museum, and he says as much about our time and culture as Schinkel building. Well, this operation about the island of museum is not only about consumption, nevertheless, and about branding. It's also a globalization of the collection, and one testimony of that is the opening or reopening, it's a bit complicated, of the Islamic Art Museum. It's a part of course, a global renovation of the Museum of Islamic Art. As I said, the Louvre is also a good example because at the same moment, more or less, the Islamic department was created in the Louvre Museum. Finally, there was the opening of this famous new gallery of Islamic art. In Berlin, we had also a strong legacy of Islamic collection, a strong legacy of Islamic knowledge in the university, in the German university, and a legacy of Orientalism and Orientalist interest. But also it's a very timely opening. And in this situation, some museums of Berlin around, in fact, this Islamic department of the Museum Island decided to create a multaka. It is a meeting point in Arabic. And multaka is designed to allow the museum to be a meeting point. That is to say, the idea was to organize guided tour by refugees in their mother tongue, especially Syrian and Iraqi refugees, to meet other refugees and to communicate about, of course, their country, but also German collection, and beyond about German hospitality and their new future in Germany. And according to the text produced at this moment, museums, I quote, play a really role between refugee native countries and their new host country, which was very important to establish a context for their life here and enable them to learn the history of Germany. So there was the Museum for Islamic Art, the Museum of Ancient Near East, the Sculpture Collection and Museum of Byzantine Art, and the German Historical Museum. And we will return to those because the German Historical Museum was a brand new museum, and the Museum of Ancient Near East is a part of Humboldt. And now it's a second operation, big one, is the Humboldt Forum. In fact, discussions and debates about the Humboldt Forum were largely at least at the beginning, but the debate will continuing a lot, about the destruction of the Palace of the Republic. Because, to be very short, there was at this location the Castle of Berlin. This Castle of Berlin, early modern one, was partly destroyed during the bombing of the Second World War. The communist government, because it's a part of East Berlin, decided to destroy completely the castle as an emblem, symbol of the Kingdom of Prussia and, of course, Prussian values, and to build instead the palace of the new Republic, of the new Socialist Republic, a building dedicated to politics, especially the kind of National Assembly, and also a building for the public pleasure, concert hall, and so on. And this building was very emblematic, of course, of East Berlin. So the decision to destroy it was a very political one, and there was another one, let's say, more political, which was not to let the space empty, but to rebuild or to reinvent, to build a new castle such the previous one. And after that, the problem was for who and for what exactly. So there were different hypotheses, but finally decided to put the part of the Museum of Dahlem inside the new building. So we will return to that big issue and that big project. And the third one was the Kulturforum, that is to say, kind of island of the museum of the western part of Berlin. Because, as I said, the Museum Island was in East Berlin. So West Berlin needed also museums and a kind of island for culture. So it was a very complicated issue, but finally there was a kind more or less of showcase of avant-garde architecture, modern art, free art, of course in the context of the Cold War. So very new buildings were conceived and given to prominent architects. At this moment you have a view of the, let's say, the beginning with the church which has been destroyed has been rebuilt, Saint-Mathieu, and Mies van der Rohe National Gallery just in front, and the beginning of a lot of enormous building built in organic style by a very famous German architect, Hans Scharum. So this is one of the panels on the site which is trying to explain to the visitor how to find, in fact, the extraordinary complex of cultural institutions, the Philharmonic Hall, the hall for the concert hall for the Berlin Orchestra, different museums, the bigger library, and some iconic buildings such as Mies van der Rohe National Gallery with a sculpture garden besides, and by Hans Scharum, the concert hall and the Libraries Southern America Institute. But they need a new museum to house a bigger collection of the 20th and 21st century and also German art. And the director of the new National Gallery said that the collection has at least tripled since the 60s. They need a new building, and in the same movement, I would say, Gerhard Richter has announced that it will be hanging over walks to the museum once it will be completed, making its best place to see his work. So the big name of German contemporary art, or one of the biggest name, let's say, Richter, will give some of his works at least in the new museum. So this museum will be the next one, a first-class museum, they said, so it's always at the top of the worldly hierarchy. It will be designed by a famous team, Herzog and de Meuron, very famous since Tate Modern, for example, and other major buildings. And it's always Hermann Persinger who is making the administration and political work, I would say, for that. Herzog and de Meuron, the Swiss brand, they said, they will build a house for 20th century art. Yes, a house, straightforward and specific. No abstract shape, because it could be not purer and not more perfect than the National Gallery, that is to say Mies van der Rohe, and not an organic, playful composition, because it would forever competing with Scharoun-like volumes. Scharoun is the other, like I said, architect for the other museum. So this is the barn, let's say, the barn by Herzog and de Meuron, which is convenient perhaps for a museum, but with the religious context of the church besides. So this is the new museum quarter of the former West Berlin. And finally, there is Dahlem, as I said, which is left behind in some kind of way, and which can be, as I said, the storage and the laboratories, the scientific research center, because Dahlem, this location is very near the Freie University, which was founded in the Cold War to be the free university instead in front of the Communist University of East Berlin. So we have this situation, and of course we have also private museum in this museumscape. The most famous one is the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, which is a legacy of Cold War, but which is very popular today, and which has been rebranded as a kind of Ukrainian war museum, because its first aim was to demonstrate that socialism was something to escape from. And most part of the display of the Checkpoint Charlie Museum is about the means to escape socialism and eventually to be killed trying to escape. So this demonstration was and is conducted throughout a very fascinating but strange display of every kind of object used to resist or to escape socialism. And in front of this kind of thing, we have another set of historical museum of history, which are the official ones, such as the Proper History Museum of Germany in Berlin, settled in the former arsenal of the Prussian army, and with a new wing designed by Pey. Pey is the famous architect of all global museums around the world, of course, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the Louvre Pyramid in Paris. We have a move to after the fall of the wall, to a very professional way of thinking about museum of history and history exhibitions, and not only in these museums dedicated to history, but also in other kind of museums, such as the former Museum of Decorative Art, the Martin Gropius Bau, which was a bit destroyed during the World War II, and which was rebuilt, and which was the location for the first and big exhibition of history after the reunification, which was about Prussia and what to think about Prussia. And what you see is the first big exhibition of history with this huge catalogue in 3 volumes, or four, I think. It was an attempt to think a new Prussia, not the militarist and the dark, I would say, Prussia, but what the new Germany could think about it. And it's the same moment that the Chancellor Kohl Chancellor, decided to build a museum dedicated to German history in the capital at the moment, Bonn, Haus der Geschichte. And this is clearly a museum dedicated to the new birth of democracy in post-war Germany. And this is also a legacy to Europe, because in fact, and you may recognize it, I don't know if you recognize, it's Brussels, it's a house of European history in Brussels. It's a museum of history of Brussels, and it was a German idea, and it was the team of this German museum who was working for the Museum of Brussels. And if you visit these 2 museums in Berlin and Brussels, you recognize clearly the kind of display, the kind of story telling, I would say. So we're coming to a museum of memory with a simple question: national or post-national, or national or global, or a global in a kind of post-national. Every combination is possible. I begin with this. It's a model you can see in Checkpoint Charlie Museum. It's a very strange model because, and I quote a journalist who described it, above the semicircle of the Spree Arch enormous semicircular arch, recalling the dome of Albert Speer Hall of the People. Under this roof, what is the allusion? The allusion is that. That's the plan by Hitler architect Albert Speer to rebuild Berlin, and this huge rotunda in the museum today, they try to build a model, and you can see at the exact scale the Nazi Panthéon or dome, and this little thing is the Brandebourg arch. So can see the kind of extraordinary crazy thing. They designed this arch, and under the roof we can see provincial objects from German history in the form of garden furniture, sheepdogs, Volkswagen, hats, rifle, vegetables, soups, and in the middle the Haus Vaterland, which the Berliners called the house for dummies because of the tourist appeal to visitors, and which was demolished in mid-70s. So it was, of course, a provocation. It was rejected by the jury, because it was a jury for building the new Museum of History that Kohl wanted at this time. And so they, of course, were very ironic about this idea, suggesting that it was back to Hitler and the Nazi side. So it was a complete failure, but I would say a provocative failure. But finally, 20 years after that, these two architects were more successful, and they built a memorial that you can see, a wall of mirrors in memory of the Jews killed in Steglitz, in the neighborhood of Berlin. It was inaugurated in '95 after a very, very long polemics and a lot of political debates. The Canadian historian Régine Robin wrote at the time that, I quote, "the local memory had succeeded in imposing itself." In fact, this memorial mirroring the landscape around, but also giving the names and the photos of the killed children, for example, is an answer to the challenges facing museum and facing a memorial museum in Berlin and elsewhere. That is to say, in fact, to give a kind of historical pathos, or to mirror a community. And it seems to me that it's very significant of this moment, the decade of the 90s, where eco-museums were also invented as mirrors of a community, mirrors that the community is offering to others, and a mirror where the community can look at herself. These moments, these decades about a museum of memory were linked to a new foundation, new branding, as I said, the new Museum of History. But there is one museum which appeared on, I would say, on the global scene as a very spectacular. It's a Jewish museum. So the idea of a Jewish museum was imagined at the beginning of the 70s, 1971, and there was a competition for the architecture in 1989, and the winner was Daniel Libeskind, who built this new part of the museum. You have the classical part of the Jewish Museum, which is a 19th century building with, I would say, traditional, more or less traditional collection of Jewish Berlin. And this new one, very different, where the emphasis is more, I quote, on creating an experience for the visitor than on museological function. And these images can demonstrate this idea between the former museum, the former part, and the new one. In fact, in the new one, you have some object. Nevertheless, the idea is to imagine an experience, and this experience is the experience of the German history. That is to say, let's say a kind of a choice between a series of catastrophic issues, the death, the exile, and so on. This Jewish museum in Berlin is a part of a kind of architectural style for Holocaust museum that some American commentators have called the empty tomb of a Jewish victim, of course. And the question is the status of this Jewish museum in Berlin. I will follow Peter Chametsky, a critic who writes that it's neither a central Holocaust museum nor an attempt to nationalize the musealization of the Holocaust on the German soil. Rather, he said, the role is, I quote, to present a German national narrative in a post-national form, unquote. And I think it's, even it seems very paradoxical, it could be applied very more broadly to several Berlin history museums. I would go to the last one of these new, very new, this one, Museum of History. It's not called a museum, but as you see, documentation center. And it's very interesting because it's plenty of objects like a museum. But the choice is interesting. So it's a museum about the expulsion of the German population at the east of the Oder-Neisse line, because at the end of the war there was this new border, the Oder-Neisse, and part, of course, of the former Germany was in Poland, is in Poland now. After the end of communism, there is today the Viadrina University, which is a new European university, right in the border, Polish-German border, with a Polish Collegium Polonicum, Polish college, and also a chair to preserve and conserve the German patrimony in Poland, which at the end of the war was problematic, of course. So this museum or documentation center is what the French politist Catherine Perron, I translate, called a visible sign with a quiet gesture. What does it mean? It means that, in fact, this museum was the result of a lobbying of the Association of Exiles, and it was politically very strong in the German political life, and it was also going more and more on the extreme right of the political landscape, let's say. But of course the federal government could not allow an extreme right movement trying to imagine an extreme right museum right in the middle of the capital with public funding and so on. So the quiet gesture is the fact that this museum is not at all a kind of a flag of the extreme right of these exiles, which would be politically insane. In the same time, it's a visible sign, that is to say that must make some transaction with, of course, the social and political demands. So it's dedicated to the memory of what they call the flight and the exile, and it's part of the theory of collective memory, and especially, and it's a bit of bibliography. Aleida Assmann wrote, I don't know if one know her name, but the German theorist Aleida Assmann wrote a book about collective memory. She made a distinction between different memories, and especially between communicative memory, which is the memory with 30 or 40 years, interpersonal and family memory, and what she calls cultural memory, which is after, let's say, 40 or 50 years. And this cultural memory is a memory through museums, through reading, books, TV shows, movies, and so on. We are just at this moment in, of course, the 1930s and 1940s, and it's the move from a communicative memory to a cultural one. And this museum or documentation center with archival material about violence, about suffering, even killings and so on. This museum is especially working about this new cultural memory. The other side of this museum, let's say, it's the idea and of course the political necessity to imagine a single place, a single building in Berlin dedicated to a kind of historical grand narrative about flight and expulsion. Because of course the good historian, let's say, dedicated their works to local situation, and it's only in very local level and in long-term view that one can understand the complexity of identification, of social identity, and the reasons why there were these expulsion and why some people escape and so on. So the idea to have a global museum dedicated to expulsion and reconciliation is clearly a political project, and a project of creating a memorial and to satisfy the claims of the association. But even is this overgeneralization, there is a social relevance to try to talk about loss, about suffering, about experiences, about very object of the everyday life. But it's also about more symbolic object, more political icons. And it's also a call to participation. And it's very traditional way to ask visitors about their feelings about home, about their feelings about loss. And the last is, of course, a part of the Europeanization of this museum and of this display, and the evocation of Ukrainian war and of the situation of refugees and exile throughout contemporary history. This is clearly a way to make an end to the localism and to the Heimat. And this is why my third part is dedicated to the crisis of the little fatherland, the Heimat, through the destiny of the museum of the city of Berlin, the Märkische Museum. It was a very traditional museum of the Heimat movement throughout 19th century Germany. It was a historicist building, and the idea was to make a museum of the local specificity. It was a museum which was debated at the moment because Berlin elite, such as the people, the curators of the museum island, a curator and art historian such as Bode had a strong contempt for this collection and for this kind of provincial museum, because his ideal of museum was universal, was European, and so on. So the success of this civic collection was nevertheless quite clear, but it is finished today, to say the less. And so the museum tried to invent or reinvent itself with a participative mode, with interactive display and devices. One of the difficulties is that this Museum of the Little Fatherland is split, in fact, into very different sites and very different kinds of display. One of them is inside a former church. This kind of corner dedicated to the religious communities in Berlin, and of course in a very classical participative way. It is about asking the visitors to say something about their religious feeling or their religious feeling. They said that there are at this moment 360 registered religious communities in Berlin, which is almost incredible. And the museum worked with the Institute of European Ethnology of Humboldt University. But in the same time, we can see that the Museum of European Ethnology itself is at Dahlem, and so very far of this Heimat museum. A last possibility would be to have a little neighborhood museum dedicated to everyday life objects, such as in Neukölln, which is a popular neighborhood of Berlin, and when the where the curator decided to make an exhibition with 99 objects. So it's a completely arbitrary choice, 99 objects. Why not 100 or 2 or 50? And it's a random choice to put showcases some pieces and to try to make an anthropological way of thinking about the social life of object, social life of things, as Appadurai and Kopitov said in their famous book. It's an alternative to the Heimat object, of course. Another one, but very political, it's the museum we can see in Spandau, Citadel, in the arsenal of Spandau, which is, well, there are many museums in this location, but the most interesting for my point of view is the museum dedicated to the statues and monuments of dark, let's say, the dark history of Berlin. So this museum, in fact, is a museum of all statues which have been condemned by the winners, in fact, of the Second World War, and after that, the winners, let's say, of the fall of the wall. So there is a first collection, which is, in fact, a collection of statues of Prussia heroes, Prussia military guys, and these statues were condemned by at the end of the Second World War. So they were defaced or pulled into storage, and finally they ended in this museum. After that, we have the Nazi period, with some objects such as the famous statue by Nazi sculptor Arno Breker, athletic pieces of Aryan guy. And finally, we have the communist era with the head of Lenin, of the most famous Lenin statue, consecrated in 1970 or 70, yes. And also a piece of Ernst Thälmann monument with dedicated by Erich Honecker, who was the chief of the German Democratic Republic. And also the monument dedicated to victims of fascism and militarism, which was in the Schinkel little temple just in front of the Opera House, and which has, of course, been put in storage. So what is the aim, in fact, of this museum? There is a clear mention in all museum labels, I quote, "This monument must inspire a new function as testimonies to German history instead of arousing respect," end quote. So it's the end of respect which is normally due to public monuments, and especially to men's statues. And it's, on the other hand, the idea that they could collaborate to a new history of the new Germany. So it's a very interesting attempt to not to make a museum of former communist statues, such as in the former communist bloc, but to make a history with them, to make a historical museum, and through this desecration. I would just mention a famous novel by Siegfried Lenz, Heimat Museum, which is a novel dedicated to an imaginary Heimat museum during the Nazi period, and the question of making something with it or burning it after the end of Nazism. So there are two people, two guys in this novel, and at one moment one said, "What did we mean by nostalgia? We longed for something inaccessible or absent. Throughout history, people have been deprived of their native lands. Our museum, instead, is not an expression of nostalgia, but a proof of loyalty to the lost land of the fatherland, the temporary lost land. Any people who believe that this land has unquestionably been theirs since time immemorial were invited to come and see the museum mute witnesses to learn the truth." So this is the defense of the museum. Finally, this museum will be burned because according to the author, it's not possible to recycle really a kind of material which has been used in so dark manner during the last decade. So it's a really interesting debate through the historical novel about what to do with this kind of material. I come with my fourth part to Humboldt Forum. Humboldt Forum is very interesting because it's a world museum in a post-colonial time, and we return to some questions we have seen previously, but in a different context. As I said, there was the castle and then the palace, the Republic Socialist building. This building was in a very prominent location in Berlin, just in front the Schinkel Museum. It was destroyed, and on the other part of the location you have this cathedral, which is also restored because it has been also bombed, and the building was during a lot of years, in fact, destroyed, and then they were thinking about what to put instead. As it's was a very complicated matter, and a politically complicated matter especially. I was interested to put the consensus machine, that is to say, it's an article of Süddeutsche Zeitung, about the manner they try to make a consensus about the Humboldt Forum politically, which could be a political lesson for a lot of countries, in fact, but which is very complicated, and obviously you are thinking it will be very confusing and it will be very difficult at the end. At the beginning, there were some labs in Dahlem, because the collection were in Dahlem. And a lot of PhD students were working at this moment about some temporary exhibitions. The idea of temporary exhibitions, it was a kind of âge d'or, a golden age of the Humboldt Forum, because nothing was built. Finally, serious things came, and it was the Ralph Appelbaum Associates, RRA, which is a multinational global brand, who was in charge of making the museum. Ralph Appelbaum Associates decided to create a world museum, to create multifaceted rooms, 40 distinct exhibitions for more than 20,000 objects. And the result is very impressive in terms of quality, of course, of the museography inside these 40 spaces dedicated to special kinds of objects. Because of the variety of the collection, there is a lot of boats. It was the pride, one of the pride of the museum, because they more or less hope that it could be the same as in New York City, famous museum about the craze for the boat. And there is also a space dedicated to sound and to ethnographic musical instruments, with a room dedicated to listening. And the first exhibition was dedicated to terrible beauty, that is to say ivory, and the situation of ivory in the world history, which had some ecological statements about the end of elephants, of course, but also political and cultural statements about the whiteness compared to other colors. A part of this Humboldt Forum is linked to the Humboldt University. So you have a laboratory exhibition about new findings of the science, social science, but also natural science, and every kind of research in the German university. It sounds great. The problem is, of course, the situation of the collection, of the extra-European collection. Because the opening of the Humboldt Forum was more or less at the same time that Bénédicte Savoy report, after the decision of President Macron in a very famous African talk to restitute to Africa at least some of the pieces of the French Museum. This situation created a context where the collection, the Prussian collection of the Humboldt Forum could seem very outdated, I would say, or less timely than it seemed to be at the first look. So this idea of restitution of goods from the colonies became a big subject, not only in Berlin, of course, but Germany and Europe. But in Berlin, it was particular because this museum was really just opening. And there were a lot of debates, I can enter the details, between journals. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for example, criticized Savoy-Sarr report for their moralizing attitude, for the disdain for African, and so on. But the political decision made by the same guy, the Prussian Minister of Culture, was to, of course, reject from the display the pieces that could have been acquired unlawfully and to organize a restitution. So in 2014, he promised to screen the object of the collection, which is a huge, of course, work, and to restitute the object from a colonial context. So there are some decisions yet and some proclamation, I would say, about especially Namibia and the Humboldt Forum. And there are also, I will end with that, some collaboration between autochthonous community and the Humboldt Forum, especially about this boat, this huge piece of the collection. And because it is a boat from New Guinea, Papuasa, the Love Boat. It is a boat of the beginning of the 20th century, 1904, but it's linked with kind of military expedition in Oceania by a German army. And of course, it's very tense context. So a team of the museum decided to try to contact the descendant of the people who, in fact, made the boat. I will end on this idea of laboratory. About these museums, there was a huge work by Berlin universities and special centers, and about them the Center for Anthropological Research on Museum and Heritage, to study the situation. The last book, a bit of bibliography, the last book is a collective book edited by Sharon MacDonald. As you see, it's called Doing Diversity in Museums and Heritage, and you have on the cover cover page a photo of a demonstration in front of the Humboldt Forum. But you have also, by the Institute for European Ethnology and other centers, a lot of studies now, a lot of PhDs that have been published. You have seen the first labs for Humboldt first steps. So Berlin is not only this city with a lot of different projects, but also a lot of university research. And finally, it's also a location for activists and activism by artists. I finished on the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art of Berlin, with an exhibition called Hello World, revising a collection in 2018. And in this exhibition, there was a work by Dirk Schmidt, an artist, that is called The Division of the Earth. Division of the Earth, tableau of the legal synopsis of the Berlin Africa Conference. Schmidt displayed 14 paintings that visualize the consequences of the legal document of the Berlin Conference. It was at the end, let's say, of a very controversial colonial involvement by Germany, especially in Namibia. And there is a legal case about the genocide of the German state. So he put in this room different huge paintings about this Conférence de Berlin, with the legal pieces, traité de protection, conditions des occupations, critères d'extermination, ordre d'extermination, and so on. And this is this piece called Conférence de Berlin, in French, in fact, because it was a diplomatic language at this moment. Thank you.